We know that the reason for the mitzvot is that they are the route to human, indeed intellectual, perfection. But how do the chukim play into this? They seem to be entirely disconnected from any of the forms of human welfare and perfection that Maimonides posits as leading us to our ultimate perfection. What Maimonides has to do, therefore, is show that they can fit into his teleological schema. And the way that he does so is by appeal to history. So in Guide Part 3, Chapter 32, he tells us the following. He first appeals to a psychological insight into human nature, which is that we are resistant to sudden changes in our belief. As he puts it here, a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible, and therefore man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. We're creatures of habit, and a sudden change in those habits is psychologically difficult for us, says Maimonides. He then appeals to the historical circumstances in which the Torah was given. So, having been slaves in Egypt, we had been surrounded by idolaters, says he, who served their gods by sacrificing animals, sometimes even humans. That's what we were used to. That's how we Israelites back then thought you communicated with God. As he writes, at that time, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world and the universal service upon which we were brought up consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which images were set up, in worshipping the latter, and in burning incense before them. So, given that this is what we were used to and that we are resistant to change, God, according to Maimonides, had to adapt his commandments to accommodate our psychological needs. Rather than abolish sacrifices, which, given that it has origins in idolatry, presumably God would have liked to do, he adapts it for good, non-idolatrous monotheists, so it can be performed in a way that suits Judaism. So it can no longer be done anywhere or by any one or two false gods. It's now done by priests in the temple for the one true God. Now, in that way, says Maimonides, as he puts it here, through this divine ruse, it came about that the memory of idolatry was effaced, and that the grandest and true foundation of our belief, namely the existence and oneness of the deity or God, was firmly established, while at the same time the souls had no feeling of repugnance and were not repelled because of the abolition of modes of worship to which they were accustomed. Now, let's be clear that we understand what Maimonides is saying here and how radical it is. Basically, sacrifices, indeed all of the chukim, have their origins somehow in idolatrous practices. Not all are like sacrifices, where God incorporates idolatrous practice. Take Shutness, for example. He believes that pagan priests used to wear mixtures of linen and wool, so we're forbidden from doing so. But the point is that all chukim are explained by their relation to such practices. Now, that means the form of the mitzvot is contingent on the time at which the Torah was revealed. If the Torah had been revealed a few hundred years later, maybe God would have had to accommodate different practices current at that time. Importantly, though, the point of all of this is to wean us away from idolatry. God is almost tricking us into worshipping him. He's using idolatrous practice, but using it to reinforce belief in the true God. And that is how chukim fit into his general teleological scheme, because they do now contribute to our intellectual perfection. They wean us away from false idolatrous beliefs and lead us to intellectual perfection, knowing there is one true God. Now, Maimonides' account of the chukim is highly controversial and has come in for a lot of criticism. For the fact is that we nowadays don't believe for 1 minute that killing animals is the only way to communicate with God. We all know that we don't need to do that. We don't need to be weaned off idolatry at all. We've been free of it for centuries. But if so, does that mean that the sacrifices, and indeed all of the chukim, have outlived their usefulness? They've passed their sell-by date, so to speak. People might have needed them 3,000 years ago when they were more primitive, but since none of us now need to be weaned away from sacrifice, are all of those mitzvot no longer justified or relevant? Now, obviously, no one does them at the moment anyway, but Maimonides believed that in the Messianic era, sacrifice would return, and the question one could ask him is, why? We don't need those mitzvot anymore to get us away from idolatry. So, Maimonides' approach is accused of actually undermining the mitzvot. It's seen as deeply controversial. And the question is whether there's any answer that a Maimonidean could give to that problem.